Oh, is it? Oh, good.
Move everything, anything you want to move.
Yeah. I don't have vision on the left side, so I always try to sit on, have people on my right.
Well, that would have been kind of fun.
Yeah, I would have, yeah.
Don't tell me these things now. You can't see anything. Can't
Yeah,
really see
when the
anything.
lights come up.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Fishtrap's Big Read finale. Thank you for coming out on this snowy night. I know you've all spent the day looking at the beauty of Wallowa County and shoveling. And I also want to welcome everybody who's out there watching this at fishtrap.org and on Fishtrap's YouTube channel. We're super happy to have you here. My name is Mike Midlum, I'm the program director here. So what is the Big Read? Well, every winter for the past 20 years, Fishtrap has put on a Big Read or Fishtrap Reads event as a way to for folks to connect during the cold winter months and read a great book together as a community. This year's book is The Cold Millions, and we're lucky enough to have the author of The Cold Millions, Jess Walter, right here. Yep. Whether you have read The Cold Millions all the way through, if you've just dipped into it, or if you just came because you were curious, essentially The Cold Millions is a best-selling novel set in Spokane. It's about two brothers who are swept into the turbulent class warfare of the early 20th century. The novel offers a portrait of a nation grappling with the chasm between rich and poor, the vulnerable and powerful. Sound familiar? Fishtrap has provided more than 700 free books to schools and libraries and community centers in Wallowa and Union counties. So kids in both counties have either gotten a copy of The Cold Millions or one of the companion books that we selected for younger readers. How many of you were here for the kickoff? The kickoff was such a fun way to start learning about the period of the early 20th century labor movement in Washington and in the Pacific Northwest. It was a blast, and we learned some songs and sang them together. Over the past month, Fishtrap and our program partners have hosted more than 15 weekly events and discussions for readers of all ages, including conversations on the labor movement, a film screening of the documentary The Wobblies, that was a blast, book discussions, activities, and more. If you didn't catch one of those, several of them are available to watch online at fishtrap.org or on Fishtrap's YouTube channel. It's cool. The NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. The program broadens our understanding of the world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of sharing a good book. Fishtrap's Big Read is supported locally, and listen to this, by the Book Loft. Thanks, Becky. Yeah! Eagle Cap Vacation Rentals, who's putting Jess up for the night. Yeah. I'm going to read a bunch of these. Hold your applause to the end. Ready? And then give them all you got. Pacific Power, the Oregon Arts Commission. Plus, we've got program partners who helped us do other events. Cook Memorial Library in La Grande, Arts Center East, Wallowa Valley Music Alliance, the Josephi Center for Arts and Culture, Wallowa History Center, and the Eastern Oregon University Library. Okay, let's get to the show. Tonight you're about to meet Fishtrap's Executive Director, Shannon McNerney. You might have found next to you or on your seat a little note card and a pencil. If you think of a question for Jess along the way, jot it down on the card or share it with somebody else. And I'll collect the cards somewhere towards the end, and then we'll ask some of the questions that way. So with that, I want to toss it to Shannon and Jess. I hope you folks enjoy, and thank you both for being here. Yep.
Before I get started, I think Mike mentioned the film The Wobblies. How many of you were here when we screened that movie? I'm just going to give a little plug for it. You can rent it on Apple, iTunes, and a bunch of other different places, YouTube. It'll cost you like $3. Do yourself a favor. It's about a 90-minute film, and you're going to hear from the voices of the people that were actually around, including one of the co-founders of the ACLU, along with Elizabeth Gurley Brown. So check it out. It's just charming. So that's the end of my plug. But that's not why we're here tonight. Movie plugs. I'll actually have some recommendations for some other films later if you want to catch me in the lobby. I'm going to read a little bio. This will be fun. Growing up in Spokane, Washington, Jess Walter always thought he'd leave his hometown for new adventures someday, to write poetry, drive along the Pacific coast, move to California, become a novelist. Spoiler alert. But other adventures came first. At 19 years old, Jess started working at a daily newspaper in Spokane, the Spokesman Review, where he became the nighttime police reporter. Chasing stories across the neighborhoods and streets where he'd grown up. He worked other jobs in his off hours and as a security guard writing parking tickets. That sounds like fun. Washing dishes at a restaurant. That actually sounds like fun. I don't know why. And wrote short stories. His first book, Every Knee Shall Bow, was about his experience covering the standoff at Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho, a piece of investigative reporting that led Jess to be named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Shortly after, he found his way to writing novels, and lucky us. Jess is the author of 10 books, including the #1 New York Times best-selling Beautiful Ruins. Side note, one of my best friends in the world, when she found out I was getting to meet you, going, "Did you read Beautiful Ruins?" I said, "No, I haven't, so I'll work on that." But she says hi. The Zero, a finalist for the National Book Award, and of course, The Cold Millions. His work has been translated into 34 languages. I didn't know there were 34 languages. Yes, I did. I knew that. And his fiction has been selected to three times for the Best American Short Stories, as well as the Pushcart Prize, among so many others. With all the success, he still lives in his hometown of Spokane and still likes to write stories. Please welcome Jess to Wallowa County, his first time. Hi.
Hi. Wow, that was a great introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to Mike, too. He helped cobble that together.
And thanks for this amazing program and for all the sponsors. And for the people putting me up, I apologize for using a frying pan to dig my car out of the snow this morning. I think it's fine. I only scooped a few times before someone came and pushed me out. So.
Thank you, Damien.
Yes, thank you, Damien. Yeah.
Oh, Wallowa County, how we love you. How is it that this is the first time you've been here and been to Fishtrap?
You know, I don't know if you noticed, but the highway doesn't go through.
Yeah, we've heard, yeah.
I have an uncle in La Grande, so I've been to La Grande a few times. But, I mean, it's stunning. I will be back to hike and...
when it's warmer.
Yeah, and see the lake when I can stand out there for more than 10 minutes without freezing. But,
it was funny when Mike and I got to meet with you over Zoom a few weeks ago. You know, we asked, I think Mike asked, so have you ever been to Wallowa County? And Jess said, yeah, I've been to La Grande. And we both looked at each other and like, so now he knows. Don't do that.
I know.
Yeah.
I will. Yeah, we'll be back for sure.
Yeah, it's like, have you been to Washington? Yeah, Seattle. Okay.
Yes, right.
Same thing. So I want to jump right into this book. First off, I have to say, it's been a long time since, this is going to sound terrible, we've done big read books a lot. I don't always love them. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's okay, right? You get to challenge yourself and read a book that isn't maybe something you necessarily pick. I loved this book.
Oh,
I
thank you.
just loved this book. So I want to say that that's about me. So that's the end of that. I want to start out with the role of place. We talk a lot about at Fishtrap, place as a character, place as a setting, our
Yeah.
mission about, in and writing, good clear thinking and good writing in and about the West. In many ways, I think Spokane almost seems like a character in the novel. How important was it for you? This story of the labor movement happened all over the United States. How important was it to you to tell the story of Spokane?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting question. And those of you who are writers, I would tell you, if you find something amazing that happened in your hometown, you probably ought to write about it. And I think for me, it was that sort of situation. I grew up in Spokane. I was born there in 1965. And there were two great periods of stagnation in Spokane. And I was born right at the beginning of one of them. And it lasted until about 15 years ago when people in Seattle and Portland realized how much cheaper our housing was. And so the last 15 years in Spokane have been like a lot of places, with people walking around Zillow drunk, thinking that their houses are worth 4 times what they paid for them, and restaurants popping up everywhere, and great bands. But that's not the city I grew up in. The city I grew up in was this quiet, conservative, not politically, I mean, in terms of growth, place, and it was very much felt stodgy. It was the kind of place people leave, not the kind of place people stay in. One of the things I wrote about Spokane probably was my first viral moment in a piece called Statistical Abstract for my hometown, Spokane, Washington, which was some stats that were both real and fictional. I wrote, number 6, there are more adult men per capita in Spokane, Washington, riding children's BMX bikes than any city in the country. And that's and that was sort of, I had a sort of joking love for Spokane. But to discover that in 1909, Spokane was doubling in size every 7 years, that it was the center of this economic boom. If you think about what's happening in Montana at that time, copper is being pulled out of the ground. Well, what's happening? Electricity is connecting the entire country. What do you need for electricity? You need copper. You have silver mines, you have agriculture, you have timber. Think of the building that's going on. All of that is funneled through this town, Spokane, which is exploding in wealth and size. 7 main railroad lines come together. If you're going to Vancouver, you got to go through Spokane. If you're going to Seattle, if you're going to Portland, those rail lines all came through. And so Spokane became a sort of drain for all of this wealth and culture. It was considered far more cultural, far more significant culturally than that harbor blight of a town, Seattle. And so imagine you've come across pictures of your parents, but they're wearing tuxedos and gowns. That's what it felt like discovering this period of Spokane. And then realizing that this class war that really erupted in the western United States from the late 1800s to about just before World War I. And it's something we don't learn about in school. We go, schools tend to go straight from the Civil War to World War I. We just sort of war hop. But we missed the fact that there was this labor movement that rose up, and that Spokane was really the first triumph of not only of this nascent labor movement, but also of nonviolent protest in the United States. And so to discover that had all happened in my hometown, and that a character like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn had come through and uncovered this scandal in the police department, it all just sort of fit in with what I think a novelist should do, which is to find those big stories and excavate them. And then I had to write something I had never done before, which was historical fiction.
Mm. So I guess kind of a follow-up to that is, and when you were doing all this research, can you think of something that just shocked you or surprised you that, again, you've grown up in Spokane, your family has roots there, that you went, holy, I had no idea.
Well, it's funny because once I started doing all this research, this is the city you live in. You recognize it. I mean, my wife and I at the time, we would buy these 110-year-old houses for almost no money, and they would have elevators in them, and it's like, who put an elevator in a house in 1910, And so you saw I like to describe it as living in a sort of, living in a city with all these ghosts. It was a sort of ghostly presence of what the city used to be. The railroad lines, on the street I live on, there are still streetcar tracks down the middle. There hasn't been streetcars in 70 years, but there are still streetcar tracks. And so there certainly those kinds of things. But I was a newspaper reporter, as you said, and I still remember, I think it was one of Tom Foley's elections. And back in the day, you would go to the morgue, which was the newspaper library, and you could pull clips on anybody you needed. So I went to pull the Foley clips, and there was Flynn E. Gurley. And I remember taking it out and reading these stories about, about this incredible protest and 500 itinerant workers jailed, and some of them dying. And so I remember filing it away. And as a novelist, those of you who are writers, I like to think of my job as being like a particularly distracted crow or magpie. I'm just flying around, and when I see a piece of garbage, I bring it back to my nest, and I carefully. And so the IWW in Spokane in 1909. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was one of those pieces of garbage that I put in my nest, and it sat there for 10 years. I would do a little bit of research, and it would sort of, work its way into my mind. And then there were two things really: my family and the times, that sort of brought me back to the idea.
How well known do you think to people that live in Spokane? How, is this story known? No,
not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I had gone to school there, and that's the other thing I wanted to do, was to bring, I grew up within, a couple of 7-irons from the beach, the river beach, where horse bones from the slaughter of 800 tribal ponies occurred, and we never learned about that either. Cities somehow ignore their own history in our zeal to teach these larger things. There's a great school in Spokane called the Community School, and they work with students who are non-traditional learners. And one of the teachers wrote me and said, "Look, we have trouble getting our kids to read. A lot of them have dropped out of other schools, so we decided to teach your book." So I gave them each a copy of your book, and they did what they usually do. They put it down and took a nap on it. And he said, "So I marched them 6 blocks," and I'll read that section that he read. I marched them to this house, and I read them this part of the book. This is toward the end of the novel. It's not really giving away too big of a plot point, but the students gathered around this 110-year-old clapboard home, and their teacher read a section from late in the book that I had written in the voice of the actual Spokane police chief at the time, John Sullivan, in 1911. He's sitting in his house. "And that's when the window behind me cracked like a bird hit it. And I tried to get up to check, but I had been stung in the back, and my chest went tight like 500 pounds was on me. The bullet had come out my chest and was in my lap. I carefully set the bullet on the table, evidence. I would die if I didn't move, so I forced myself up, stumbled to the telephone, and remembered that 2 days earlier our line had been cut. But it was fixed now, for it was department policy, no captain be without a phone. And the operator came on and said, 'Police desk.' Ed Person was the sergeant, and I said, 'Send a wagon.' And Ed said, 'Where to?' And I said, 1320 West Cinto. And Ed said, 'That's your house, John.' And I said, 'I know it's my house, Ed. It's where they shot me.' And anyway, so the teacher pointed to that house and said, 'That happened right here.' The next day, he said every student was just, because it was so relevant. It was in there. Last year, so now they read it every year. Last year, they put me on trial. You can Google the trial of Jess Walter and it'll pop up. They tried me for the murder of youthful idealism. For what happens to one of the characters late in the book. And one student came in with a pillow in her tummy and she testified as a pregnant Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And other students did these other things. They found me guilty. The jury did this hilarious thing. They stood up, did a lap, and just sat back down and said, "Guilty, Your Honor." And my penalty was I had to name a future character after one of the students. But it's been so great watching the schools in Spokane embrace a period of their history. And of course, history is more relevant when it comes back to us in some way.
Wow. It's really interesting because I had written a question that I'm not going to ask you now because you answered it. How well are they known? Are there still ghosts present? So it's interesting that you said that. Yeah. I heard an interview. I did some snooping. Some snooping around. Yeah, I told you about this.
I repeat myself. Things. You'll probably realize.
We can talk later.
Yeah.
I heard an interview where you described the process of writing this story as, like, you called it like describing a car that's running off the road.
You know, that's not actually this book.
Well, okay.
Yeah, the novel I have coming out is very much that way. About every fourth novel, I like to just write something really fast and timely and of the moment. Yeah. I did that with the Financial Lives of the Poets, which was about the financial crisis of 2008. And the next novel is about how politics has riven families and friends and people more than any time since the late 1960s. And so I wanted to just write about that in a very... This book, though, was much more... I do like to come up with metaphors for books, and the metaphor for this novel for me was the Spokane River. The novel begins and ends at the river. It takes place in the 100 years that the city sort of settled around this river, and I started thinking about the structure of the novel itself like a river. It's told in the third person, and so you have those third person sections with Gig and Rye in which they're narrated in an almost Steinbeckian voice, a Dos Passos-like zeal for a better America kind of hovering over the top. So you have that third person main channel of the river, and then I fell in love with the idea of the teeming early 1900s, like E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, and I wanted different characters to come in with these first-person stories like tributaries or undercurrents, speeding up the novel. And so it always helps me to have those sort of metaphoric ideas behind the writing of the novel. And so for this one, I to this day still think of it as a sort of meandering river with these first-person sections coming in.
I think why that stuck in my head is I was thinking about there's quite literally a scene that you write of a car running off the road. So, you really are describing that, and also a raft going off.
Right, yeah.
So it just was interesting that you kept that momentum. You could feel the speed, and also it was interesting to me with that, again, spoiler, if you haven't read the novel, there's violence.
Yes.
It's a little Thelma and Louise. But there's a moment where it reminded me of that when you're going through a car accident or something where everything slows down at the same time. It was an interesting, you really were describing it as it was going off the road.
Yes, so. I suppose I literally did this time.
Yes, you really did, yeah. I wanted to go, I actually had a bunch of questions about the first person, the way you wrote those characters and how you brought them in. I was actually talking to my mom about this, that every time you switch to a first person, well, especially after the second time, I thought, oh God, they're going to die. So I'm wondering if that was, there were only, I think, 3 or 4 characters that you'd switched to first person that didn't during the end of that. Was there a decision point about that, or why did you make that choice?
It was interesting. The difficult thing for me was the balance between the fact that this really happened and some of these characters were real people. And I kept feeling a sort of responsibility. And one thing that led me to was the idea that when I wrote about John Sullivan or Elizabeth Gurley Flynn or any of the characters who really existed, I would really try to stick to their real stories. Much less fiction in those sections. The things Elizabeth Gurley Flynn says, she pretty much said. The things that John Sullivan did and said are pretty much they do track with what happened. The other thing was I kept thinking these people were alive just 100 years ago, and that responsibility felt so strange to me. And so this thing really was framed by the deaths of two police officers, Waterbury at the beginning and Sullivan at the end. And I thought, the intimacy of seeing those characters in their last moments struck me. And then what often drives me as a writer is, have I done this before? And I'd never written a character to the end of their life before. I'd never even seen it. Since then, I've thought of a couple books where that happens. But the idea of writing characters until their very last moment struck me as something that would give the book a sort of deeper intimacy. There's a little key. If there's a date with their name, that's the end. And the very last one is Rye, 1964.
Yeah.
That's the year Elizabeth Gurley Flynn dies. And in my imagination, he's the one character we don't see to the very end, but we're in his last year in 1964. The novel begins, really covers that 1909-1910 period. But the first chronological thing that happens is 1864, and I liked that 100 years. I always think as a writer that you need to keep your inspirations at least as close as you keep your insecurities. And so I love the novel 100 Years of Solitude. And my idea was to write 100 years of Spokane history and embed it in this almost late period Western about labor unions.
Well, speaking of that 100 years, you said earlier, and again, another interview, but I really hadn't thought about this with the character of Jules.
Yeah.
That he really is, I think, used as, I think as you put it, kind of I wrote it down and now I can't find it, that you talked to him about, as a witness to the events of the story. And what really struck me when I read that is I went back again after reading it and then hearing that, and I looked back, and Jules is gone as a character really early in the novel, but his influence, he's got a presence that carries all the way to the end. I'm curious about what you thought about when you created that character. Was he based on someone real? Is there an amalgam there?
I did not think that I wanted to write a story about Spokane history and ignore the original Spokane people. Like a lot of places in the West especially, actually throughout all over the country, we live in places that are named for the people we drove from them. Not we, but our predecessors, our ancestors. And so, and again, growing up just downstream from a place where 800 ponies were gathered and shot to punish the Spokanes and to force them into a starvation and onto a reservation. And then not learning about that in school, I felt like that was an important part. But I also wanted to make Jules not, I didn't want to give him a spirit animal. I wanted him to just be another worker, because that's what he would have been at that time. He sees this kid, he as a young man, gets this idea that we all go over alone, and that becomes, for a lot of the characters as they die, the alternative to the brotherhood of the early labor movement, where we don't go over alone, where we try to lift each other up. And another big part of the novel for me was coming from a really working class family. Both of my grandfathers were itinerant workers, hopped the rails, and as a kid on my grandpa's cattle ranch, hearing those stories, they were so romantic to me. I loved Treasure Island, and all I wanted to do was stow away on anything. And the fact that my grandfather had stowed away on a train and would jump off before they got to the town and look for work. I loved the romanticism of that, and I really wanted to capture that. And then my dad, who decided school had enough of him at about 13 and joined the Navy and worked for a while on his dad's ranch and ended up getting a job at Kaiser Aluminum and then becoming a labor guy. My dad was a union president. And in our family, that meant you lift up the least of everyone. If my dad thought that I wasn't being nice to every kid in school, I would hear about it. If my mom would sit down with me with the yearbook and point out every girl in glasses and ask why I didn't ask her out. And so it wasn't about politics. It was just about fairness and trying to bring everyone up. And that's what I remember. So when I was thinking about working on the novel and thinking my dad had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's quite a few years earlier. And when I wrote Beautiful Ruins, which has a big romantic heart and is set in Italy, I wrote that in part because I wanted to take my mom there as she was dying. And so I thought, I need to write a book for my dad. I want to write like a late period Western, and I want to write about the birth of unionism, again, not as a political movement or anything, but as an ideal. And so, so really that was, kind of what the other piece that connected.
I do have a character I want to.
Sure.
Well, there's two, but I'll try to pick one.
Mm-hmm.
So Lembrand.
Lemuel Brand, yeah.
How was he created? What did you? I mean, there's we can talk about robber barons and all sorts of folks, but were there pieces or elements of that you found in other people's stories that you brought together? Was it, I'm just curious where he came from.
One place that he came from, my original hero as a writer was Kurt Vonnegut Jr. When I was a kid, when I was 13, I would go to my middle school library and imagine where my books would one day be filed, and that's how I first discovered a Kurt Vonnegut novel.
Nice.
And Breakfast of Champions, which on page 13 he says, this is my drawing of an asshole, and he draws an asterisk. And as a 13-year-old, you think if they don't give the Nobel Prize for that, then what else is there? But Vonnegut always said when writers would ask him for advice, he had two pieces of advice. They'd throw away the first chapter and put a villain in it. And it's hard for me to create villains because I believe no one thinks they're a villain. Everyone is sure they're doing the right thing, right? And so my first idea was to really create an antagonist to sort of, but as always, I want, the speeches that he gives to Rye, I think kind of make sense, at the time, Spokane was beset with wealth, men like Lembrand who, Alhambra, the house that he builds is based on about 3 different houses that actually existed in Spokane. One of them that you can still do tours, the Campbell House next to the museum. And a friend of mine was taking a tour, and she said to the tour guide, was Campbell liked by his workers? And the tour guide went, no. Didn't want to say it out loud. And so very much those pieces, of actual wealth kind of came together. Because there was amazing wealth, there also was the deepest poverty. As many as 20,000 workers would gather at various times looking for any sort of day jobs, menial labor. These weren't tradesmen. These were people who, carried their own hoes, which is what a hobo is, a boy who carries a hoe, or shovels, or sometimes just their bare hands doing the most basic work. And so I really needed the difference in those two worlds. And so Lembrand rose out of that desire to create an antagonist to the heroes.
Well, that's interesting because I thought about that afterwards, thinking, well, who were the real antagonists in this story? And I think because of the way you wrote the characters, I think about, Early, who in some ways is probably the most sociopathic character in the book, but yet you can kind of, when his conversation earlier with Rye, you kind of see, whoa.
Yeah, he makes great points, right, exactly.
Not wrong, and the same thing, I was going to ask you,
And I think we can justify just about anything, through argument, except our actions.
Right,
and, Early Reston was an interesting character. Another thing I'd never done was created a character whose motivation even I didn't know.
Right.
And so that was fun to do. I thought, I'm going to make him an agent of chaos. There's a great book called Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas, which is about this same period, and it's about the assassination of the governor of Idaho, Steunenberg, in 1904, I believe, and the IWW, many of the Western Federation of Miners, some of those people were blamed for it, and they arrested an anarchist named Harry Orchard. But Harry Orchard claimed he wasn't an anarchist. He was a Pinkerton posing as an anarchist. But then he claimed he was an anarchist posing as a Pinkerton posing as an anarchist. And then he claimed he was a Pinkerton posing as an anarchist posing as a Pinkerton posing. And so, I don't even know if he knew his own motivation. And so in creating Early Reston, I wanted to create a character who's, who could explain some of the violence in a logistical way, but be this agent of chaos. And again, one of the reasons I write is just to have fun, and it's really fun creating characters like those two, or Del Dalvo, my other villain.
That was who I was going to ask you about next.
Del was so fun.
Him. I don't know what that says. But
many of the Pinkertons came from the UK, from England and Ireland. And so as I was doing this Pinkerton research, I started reading late 19th century mysteries and coming across all this language that I'd never seen before. And some characters, I would say primarily Del Dalvo and Ursula the Great, when they come on stage, it's like they're just speaking to me, and it's so fun just quickly transcribing what they say. And so Del Dalvo saying, "Spokane gave me the morbs," the first words out of his mouth. And we don't use the word morbs anymore, but it's a morbid feeling of unease. Anyone who watches TV news knows what the morbs is. It's that feeling. And so that was, so creating that character, and again, you create someone who's sort of villainous, and yet his death haunted me. I had nightmares that night. Him being steered like a boat tiller with a knife in him, and I felt, even then you start feeling great sympathy, even for the villains that you create. And there's a moment where he's thinking about his grandson, who he thinks is like 4 or 7. He doesn't really know. And I realized, oh, poor Del, he's a terrible grandparent too.
But there was an integrity with him that was interesting. It's like he was bad, but he wasn't trying to convince himself he wasn't. I mean,
no,
that's
true.
That was the problem with Sullivan a little bit. That it's like,
And I think Sullivan was really tortured. I think he was a man of a different era. And trying to, really bring a corrupt police department into a period when, the churches were demanding that Spokane stop being a giant brothel and casino, and actually, and so I thought, you really try to capture that part of those characters. So.
We're gonna just want to remind folks in a couple minutes, Mike and some of the gang are going to come around. If you have questions, this is the time to wave your little card, and we'll come around and get them here in a second. Class plays a big role. I think in the story we tell ourselves, the United States is a classless society, and of course, we can define class in lots of ways. But classless, as we've discovered, it's not true. How did the class or the caste system impact both your writing, but also, obviously you talk about the income gap and the robber barons and this kind of post-Gilded Age-ish, and the parallels that we're seeing now with that income gap. How did you wrote about class really interestingly, and I'm curious if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that was the other thing that really drove me to the story, was we had reached a point in the United States when we had the same gap between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest, as the end of the last Gilded Age. And in fact, if you were to look at the chart, it was exactly 1909 that we hit in 2021.
Oh, really?
The exact same gap between the wealthiest and poorest Americans. Most of us probably grew up middle class, in some level of middle class, lower middle class, and that's what has shrunk as these other two groups. And the last time that the top 1% had as much accumulated wealth and income, not just how much you make, but wealth, was 1909, when the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Rockefellers had absorbed all of this money. You know, for better or worse, we have decided billionaires should be in charge of the government again. So maybe they'll fix it. I don't know, but that was the other thing that drove me, was this idea that we repeat things. You know, the populists move over here, the elite move over there, but we repeat. We repeat these cycles, and I felt like we were in a cycle that felt very much like the period that I was growing up in, or the period that I was writing about, that I felt like we were in a period very much like that. And to watch young people, my kids especially, are very politically active and are very frustrated. And so I went to a period, 1909, when someone like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a 19-year-old pregnant labor activist, 10 years before she has the right to vote, is standing on street corners demanding the emancipation of the vagina and that workers be treated well. And it's hard for me to imagine that character now, let alone 10 years before she has the right to vote. And that again sort of motivated me into the story and to write about, you know, how these patterns repeat, but we don't always see them because, you know, like I said, populism moves from there to there, and one side is more hawkish than the other, but some things stay the same, and one of them is the very poorest of us are demonized for it.
Right.
If you were a hobo in Spokane hoping to get a job, you would hop off a train in 1909, you would sleep outside, you would go to Stevens Street, you'd pay $1 to get a job. The job shark, the job agent, would take that $1, send you out to a job. He's now splitting that $1 with the foreman, and so they'd probably fire you after about 5 days. You'd have to pay for your food and your medical care out of the $1.50 you made a day, and then you'd be sent off. And if you went back to Spokane to spend your $3 on a drink or something, you'd be beaten by the police and dragged to the end of town. And we demonize poverty in a lot of different ways. And now it's mainly because the people that we see who are homeless are the froth of a big wave coming in. It's not the wave, there's real homelessness. There are really people who are struggling. What we see are fentanyl, people breaking into our garage, and that becomes in our mind what it means to be poor, to be the least of us. And again, if we don't take care of the least of us, then we end up in the exact same place. And so it was really a way to write about the current time without wading into politics as it is now, but looking at the politics of another time and the culture of another time, and hopefully returning to the idea that we are compassionate toward the least and not blaming them. I feel sometimes like we've hit people with our cars and then blamed them for getting in our way.
Right.
You know?
Right. So do you find any signal or sign of hope from the research that you did in this story that gives you ideas? Or?
My kids tell me I suffer from toxic positivity, so I find hope all the time. I've yet to meet a person at a book reading or another event who's like, well, I'm anti-compassion, So I think we define it differently. We think sometimes it's wasted in certain ways. So I think sometimes if we can tune out the noise, and one thing about realizing the cycles of history is that you do realize they're cycles and that they end, and that 4 years seems like a long time, or 2 years, or 8 years. And it's really not. And I'm a Pinkerite, a Steven Pinkerite. He's the philosopher who thinks that things do actually tend to get better, even though they take downturns. I don't know what to say about climate change. That tests even my toxic positivity. But no, I find great hope, and I think I wait for a cycle when we're not at each other's throats and we are solving some of these problems.
Do we have any questions before I ask another one? Yes, here they come. Janice, were there any questions online? Okay. We got a few. Well, I'll let you know. If I can't read your handwriting, I will either not read your question or I'll make it up. So it'll be fun. Can't read that.
So
Hang
many
on.
questions.
Okay, here comes some more. Oh, have any of your books been optioned for film?
Almost all of them. Let's see. Citizen Vince is probably the closest, a novel from 2006. It has been under option since 2006, and Billy Bob Thornton and I are trying to make it. Billy's great, yeah. And Beautiful Ruins has come really close several times. It's among the directors who've been attached to it at one time were Sam Mendes, who made so many Bond movies, and Steven Spielberg, who decided to make The Fabelmans instead of Beautiful Ruins. Nikki Caro. Hollywood is the most speculative business, and so they're always optioning things and trying to make them. The Cold Millions was briefly considered as a TV show and is now being possibly written as an opera for the Metropolitan Opera in New York.
I can actually see that.
And in fact, they've said, how are we going to have a Model T go off the opera stage? They want to do that. So we'll see if that happens. Growing up, first generation college student in the Valley of Spokane, Washington, I always dreamed that my work would become an opera. No, I didn't. I will have to find the right formal wear if it happens.
See, my dream is that my life will become an opera.
Yeah.
But some would argue it has. So.
And then, the other one that's very close is, I love writing short stories, probably my favorite form. And my last book, The Angel of Rome, which is probably the favorite of all my books. The title story is we're about to film, hopefully next year, with Ethan Hawke in Italy. So
Nice.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
2026. Yeah.
So this is a good, interesting question. Do you need a storyboard to keep track? How do you keep track of all your characters?
That is a
and the
good question.
storylines?
I
Yeah.
don't usually, and I never do at the beginning. I sort of let it flow at the beginning, and then I do start outlining about a third or a halfway through, just so I can see where it's going. I have a general idea when I start. I imagine I'm driving from Seattle to Miami, and so I start tracking which highways to take. Eventually, though, I realize, I think I'm going to Connecticut. No, I'm going to the Gulf of Mexico. And so that it always sort of changes, so I have to outline to make sure that I'm going to, someone say the Gulf of America. I'm going to Belize. How's
There you
that?
go.
And so charting that makes outlining, and this one I did have a flow chart because I wanted to see how much space between those first-person stories coming in, and so this one probably took more outlining than most of them.
Yeah.
But no, I typically the novel I just finished, I had sort of the beginning and the end scoped out, and then it was just entertaining myself honestly in between.
So can you tell us a little bit about that novel? Are you allowed?
Yeah, it's a guy who gets fed up with politics, and he moves out to live off the grid, and he has punched his son-in-law at a Thanksgiving dinner, and then he's just like, I'm out, and he goes to this land that he's owned forever, and he's decided to hide away, and then there's a knock on his door 7 years later, and he opens it, and there's two kids, and he says, magazines or chocolate bars? And they're like, what? And he says, what do you fine young capitalists selling? And they're like, we're your grandchildren. His daughter's gone missing. His son-in-law is wrapped up with some ruffians, and he's got to come out of hiding with no cell phone, no computer, a car that barely runs, and try to put his family back together. And it's the idea that we can't turn our backs on each other even when we disagree, is sort of but I very much wrote it in the vein of Charles Portis, True Grit. You know, where you just start with an observation. You start with an objective. You know, I need to find my daughter and return her grandkids, and then I just try to write it fast and funny and toxically hopeful. So yeah.
Ooh, toxically hopeful.
Yeah.
Sounds like a next. Oh, okay. An Ursula question.
Yes.
I'm happy. I wanted to ask an Ursula question. This is a good one. So, when you were doing your research on Ursula, did you have any interesting or fun discoveries about
Oh my gosh.
those? I would say brave women
Yeah.
that didn't get into the book. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to write Ursula and have her be a main character is because you can't really write a novel about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in 1909 and have it be representative of women's lives.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
she was really one of a kind at the time. I mean, there was a sort of brand of firebrand progressive women like Emma Goldman, like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who were going around the country, fighting like this. But I wanted someone to have a different kind of power that you could have in that time. And I had become so interested in the fact that Spokane was this center of entertainment. Had the largest theater stage in America was in Spokane, which Del Dalvo gets sick of hearing about. And there were 10 big theaters that got culturally less sophisticated as you moved east to downtown until you got to the theaters that were by the opium dens and cribs of sporting women, as they called them.
Yeah.
And those would have vaudeville. They would have, and so as I was doing this research, this is one of those great moments. I'm researching this book for 2 or 3 years. I'm going every day down to the Spokane Library, the Northwest Room, and I'm just looking through microfilm, Washington State University's library with other newspapers. There were 5 or 6 newspapers at any given time in Spokane. And so just reading all of them and reading how differently we think that we've invented news, MSNBC reports the progressive side and Fox reports the conservative side. That happened in 1909 too. I would read about these things and I would think this isn't even the same event. But I'm reading all these newspapers and I'm reading about, and then you're going to the shows and seeing what was playing, and I'm taking notes. And I got home and I looked, and I'd written about the fabulous Fritz, who would fight any animal you brought on stage, like something out of Blazing Saddles. You'd punch a horse and it would fall over, and people would pay to see that. And I had written in my journal, Ursula the Great sings and dances with a live cougar, and I thought, did I research that or did I make that up? And so I went back and repeated my research, and I'd invented her. And then I had some problems. I'm like, wait a minute, if she's named Ursula, wouldn't it be a bear? Because Ursa is the Latin word for bear. And so I had to explain why it was no longer a bear. And then I made her the second Ursula. And then I'm like, what? How does the cougar not eat her? And then if
Lady Gaga, is that what?
No, it was just the acts of the time. And so then I came up with, I think, the greatest literary invention I've ever done, which is that she sews meat into a corset and throws it to the cougar, and he knows if he just growls, he'll get get this meat in the corset. And again, the fact they don't give the Nobel Prize for stuff like this is, but it was one of those great moments when you realize. For me, researching a novel, especially set in another place or another time, you have to achieve a kind of fluency, like with a language. And I was so fluent in 1909 that I was inventing my own vaudeville acts. And so it was time to lay off about half of the research department and just bring the fiction department on and have them start writing.
This is an interesting question about Rye. I missed this in the epilogue. This is interesting. The question is, in the epilogue, Raya is financially secure, wealthy beyond measure compared to his youth, thanks to a union job, and yet his son is a devotee of Anne Rand.
Yeah, I loved that about him.
Yeah. Do you think that presages our current politics?
Like I said, it's almost like mirror image of our current politics, And so again, if I was writing about the 1960s, the dad might be a Goldwater voter and the kid might be voting for Jerry Brown, or, and so those things trade places. I've had so many people come up to me and say, my grandfather was involved in the labor movement, but he never talked about it. And what happened was, it turned out communism as practiced in the Soviet Union was the most brutal, was in many ways as brutal as Nazi Germany, more in some ways. And so what became of this nascent socialist movement was something that people were ashamed to be, especially in the United States after the Red Scares of first 1919 and then the 1950s. And so many people just sort of didn't talk about that. I'm sorry, what was the question? I got off on a side track.
Yeah, I think you answered it. It was, does this presage our current politics?
Yeah, but so moving the book to 1964 and having Rye be settled financially, and he was able to raise a family. I mean, if you look at what Rye wanted in the book, he was not, his brother Gig was very much involved in this movement. He just wanted a home and a family. And so it's funny, Rye is really not the hero of the novel. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn probably is, because she does most of the action. Rye is almost the field upon which this is played out. And he achieves the thing that he wanted. And if you were at the leading edge of protest, of activism, you often don't get the world you want. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn did not leave behind a world where workers owned the means of production. But because of the labor movement, because workers didn't have to work 16-hour days anymore, people like Rye could raise a family. And so I loved that at the end of the novel. He retires from work in 1964, which is the year my dad went to work at Kaiser, and the year before I was born. And like I said, this was a book. My dad never really understood what I did for a living. Up until even a few years ago, he was still bringing me the want ads with jobs circled, and he finally came to an event in Spokane, and there were like 600 people, and he kept looking back over his shoulder, and he never bought lunch again after that. But and he used to, when I would go out on book tour, he would say, "What do you do on book tour?" And I'd say, "Well, I go to colleges and bookstores and places, and I give readings." And he said, "You wrote the damn thing, you have to read it to them too?" And I said, "No, I just read a little bit, Dad. They go home and read it on their own." And so I loved that I could, even though my dad was sort of beyond being able to understand the book with his dementia, I would tell him about it all the time. And there are some beautiful things about dementia, because every time I told him about it, he liked it even more. It was the first time he'd heard about it too, So I'd say, "Yeah, the main character goes to work at Kaiser." "You're kidding! Have I told you about Kaiser?" I said, "Yeah, you've told me about Kaiser." So, yeah.
This is a good question. Our friend Evelyn asked, I know where the title came from in the book, as how it's referenced, but how did you come up with the Cold Millions? Is that a reference again, another creation?
Because I was writing a late period Western. I grew up next to a drive-in movie theater. My dad loved movies. We loved Westerns. And at some point I realized I'm writing like a Clint Eastwood movie, like a stranger rides into town, but instead of Clint Eastwood, it's a 19-year-old pregnant girl demanding the emancipation of the vagina. But still, it's basically a Clint Eastwood story. And so in the first drafts of the novel, I called it Nothing West of Dead, which is what one of the characters, there's nothing west of Spokane because there's nothing west of Dead. And I thought, that's a great Western title. But the more I wrote, I thought, this is not really a Western. This is a social novel, a cultural novel. And probably my favorite moments in the novel, the places where I made myself a little weepy, both occurred in libraries. The first one was Lem Brand's library, that floor-to-ceiling library where he hasn't read any of his own books. And that's where Rye is sitting, and he's looking around, and he's thinking about a girl who he saw frozen to death on a train, and he's thinking about how poor his family is, and he's thinking all his brother wants is the rest of War and Peace. And here this man has all these books and they mean nothing to him. And that moment, as I was writing it, I typed the phrase, the cold millions, and I just went, oh, that's what my novel's called. Sorry, Dad, you don't get your Western. It's a social novel instead. And the second library scene, of course, is a Carnegie library, which is interesting because the Carnegies were another incredibly wealthy family that then started donating their money to build libraries across the country. And that's the other place where Rye is sort of treated like a human being, is in the Carnegie Library at the end. So both those things, I grew up in libraries, and so they made me weepy, both of those scenes. But yeah, I honestly just typed the phrase and thought, oh, there's my title.
Well, I think you're surrounded by library people here, so.
Oh, am I?
Yeah.
Yeah, you
There's
look
a
like you've been in a
Carnegie-
library
yeah,
before.
there's a Carnegie Library
Is
just,
there?
just a couple
Yeah.
blocks from here.
They're
so,
beautiful
yeah.
buildings,
Yeah,
aren't they?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before I let you go, is there anything you would like to maybe read for us that you,
Boy,
you know?
I don't think so. I
I
think
think you answered all the
I
things.
think I answered all the questions. They were great questions. Thank you, and
Yeah,
thanks
yeah,
for
you guys are
thanks
brilliant.
again for this great program. I loved seeing everything that you did, the music and the films that you watched, and yeah, it was. As an author, this is why you write, is to bring people not just to your work, but to the ideas that surround the thing that went into creating it. So thank you.
We've had, thanks to our friend Rich and the 38 years of Fishtrap, we've had a long line of remarkable writers
Yeah.
that have come through this place. You know, we always talk about it. The Loudoun County punches above its class sometimes with the
yeah.
writers.
Literarily,
Thank you for
certainly.
being part of that
Yeah, thank you,
tradition,
Shannon.
and I hope that, we want him back for maybe some other programs that we do. So I'm going to bring Mike up here in a second. We are going to, come on up, Mike. We're going to, after this, you're going to get a chance to get your book signed. Becky in the back is going to be selling some books. If you haven't bought your copy yet, my goodness, buy one for a friend. And you'll get a chance to meet Jess up close and in person. And before I walk away, I also want to thank our friends at our brand new restaurant next door, the Sasquatch, provided dinner for us tonight.
It's
and
delicious.
just check them out, man. They're awesome. So that's what I have to say,
Thanks.
Mike.
Great. Good job. All the D60s out. Thanks, everybody. I just want to, this was really fun. Thanks for being here. It was great. We have a couple other programs coming up very soon. I want to let you know we're going hot, man. There's a lot happening at Fishtrap. This Friday, 2 days from now, is Fishtrap Fireside, our program for local readers. The readers are Gregory Rollins, who's coming from Union County, Robin Pace, and John Rombach. So that'll be Friday night. And then next weekend is Winter Fishtrap, our 3-day conference where we talk about issues that are important to people of the West. It starts Friday and goes till Sunday. You can sign up for it. Our theme this year is, what is the West? And some of our guests our panelists and guests are, it's a pretty heavy hitter kind of a weekend. Take a look at fishtrap.org at Winter Fishtrap, or I can show it to you on the computer afterwards. I hope you can join us. So, without that, say hi to Becky, buy a book, and also Jess will be over here signing books in just a few minutes. Still snacks, and thanks for being here.